Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. So here I'm in Kingston upon Thames, United Kingdom. And behind me is the house where Cesar Picton lived with that plaque through most of his life, well, right up to his death in the early 19th century. So Cesar Picton is notable for being one of the first prominent black free people in British history. And all right, people say in ancient Roman times there were black people here. Rather depends what you mean by black. Often they're people from the Roman provinces of North Africa. Were not what we would typically think of being black. And yes, there were a very few black people here in the Middle Ages. But anyway, so Cesar Picton was born in what's now Senegal. It's probable he was brought up as a Muslim. We're not certain of that. So he was kidnapped when he was a very young child. It's estimated he was 6 years old. And a British Army officer had him. I don't know whether he abducted him himself or he purchased Cesar Picton from someone else. We don't know what Cesar Picton's real name was. Of course, he was certainly given that name by his abductors. So they often, black people who were captured in Africa or transported into servitude in the Americas, they were often given these mockingly grand names referring to people from classical antiquity. And perhaps it was a Mr. Picton who actually kidnapped him or purchased him, because these unfortunate people were just treated as mere chattels. Anyway, a British Army officer brought him to this country, and he gave him as a gift to Sir John Phillips, along with a parakeet and some other beast. So he was being dehumanized, put on that level. Now, obviously terrible for Cesar Picton to be kidnapped, separated from his family, but luckily for him, the people who got to own him, and that was the legal status of ownership, weren't that cruel, and he was treated decently as a servant. So slavery wasn't abolished in England and Wales until 1772. It was permitted in the colonies till 1834, but it wasn't permitted in England and Wales itself. So the Somerset case occurred when Cesar Picton was an adolescent, where James Somerset was able to challenge his servitude, and it was found that in the 11th century, slavery had been abolished in this land. So Somerset was free, and any person who was held in servitude was brought to this country immediately gained liberty. But anyway, so he worked as a servant in his family, and they spent a lot of money on silken clothes for him. So people showed him off. It was a bit of a, what would I say, a curiosity, because there were very, very few non-white people in the country at the time. There were some Indians, sailors and merchants and so forth who came to London. So Kingston upon Thames is considered well within the boundaries of London. Back then it was definitely outside London. It was deep in the countryside. This was Surrey. So when his master and mistress died, he was left a bequest of £100, which is a very tidy sum at the time. Bearing in mind you could buy a good horse for £5. So he set himself up as a coal merchant, and the river is just the other side of that house. So coal was being shipped down the river here, and then you could sell it on to London or sell it here in Kingston upon Thames. Is the River Thames, which lies hard by. So Cesar Picton, he really prospered in his trade, though he never wed. He was literate. There are many documents which are written by his own hand, and that was not something which could go without saying, because of course there was no publicly funded compulsory schooling in this country till 1870. So some people never went to school for a single day. By the late 18th century, most British people were literate, even if to a very low level. That was ahead of almost every other country in the world. So he did very well for himself. He'd been christened, so he was a practicing member of the Church of England, which was the state church. Now the abolitionist movement was moving towards its height in his adulthood. However, he never concerned himself with this, does not seem to be socialise with other black people. Laura Equiano was one of his contemporaries. So there is an oil painting of him, but some doubt of who it was of. Anything else about him? Yes, so he owned a house worth £4,000, which is a huge sum, so he did very well for himself. And then he died in the early 19th century. I can't remember the exact year. So he's buried in All Saints Church, which is very close to here. And he was a very tall man. We know that, very heavy man as well, from the fact that it took some trolley to transport his coffin. So that is enough about Gustavus Picton, who lived here in Kingston upon Thames. So that's enough from me, George from Ireland. Please follow my channel, and please, what was I going to say, subscribe to me, yes. Make sure you donate most liberally on PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. And I do online lessons in history, politics, religious studies, French, law, geography, citizenship, English language, English literature, English as a foreign language, and so forth. Okay, so toodaloo.